Hi, everyone. Welcome to The World This Week. The World This Week in partnership with The Daily Beast. This Friday, we're going to New Delhi. Mandakini Galat is our India correspondent. How are you?
Not so bad. We're getting ready to ease the lockdown here.
You've changed locations, Mandakini.
I have. There's just in a different space now, and looking forward to the lockdown being lifted.
We'll talk more about it shortly. We're also joined from the Normandy beaches, from the city of Caen, by Paris Match Deputy Editor-in-Chief Régis Le Sommier. How are you?
I'm very good. How about yourself?
Not so bad. You're just back from Brazil. We're going to talk more about that later in the show. Also joining us from Toronto, he is investigative reporter Marco Choan Ovid for the Toronto Star. How are you?
Great. Thanks for having me on, François.
All right, glad to have you. And okay, so here it is. I'm at home. I have not been in the office since March 13th. We're easing confinement, but trying to limit the number of people in the office at France 24. So imagine the irony. François Picard is here in his home. Aaron Ogunke of France 24 fame is at the office. What's it like, Aaron?
That's right, François. Feels good to be in your spot, I guess. So I'll just give a little behind-the-scenes tour of a France 24 English studio. You can see the prompter here, all of the different screens and lights that intimidate people who go on set regularly. So I'll leave the studio now and take you through a little tour of the newsroom.
I'm getting nostalgic. I miss it.
Yeah, I think everyone misses you too, but it's kind of not the same because it's really socially distanced. Everyone is spread out. Usually there's teams all throughout here in the afternoon and all of these desks are empty, but I'll take you kind of to the hub of the bosses. The red chefs are here. Arnaud is
Red
working
chefs
diligently
are the
there.
Producers. That's
Yeah, and senior producers as well. Most people are wearing masks because it's now obligatory. But that's that. Here's the executive offices, and I'm going to find my spot in here.
All right, Aaron Ogunke, who's found herself a cubicle. Glad you could join us there from the newsroom. And one story has really dominated the news this week. There was the protests. There was all over America and beyond over the death of George Floyd. Now comes the time for the memorials. On Friday, a first service taking place in Minnesota.
George Floyd's story has been the story of black folks, because ever since 401 years ago, the reason we could never be who we wanted and dreamed to be in is you kept your knee on our neck.
Aaron Ogunke, I was speaking to a reporter who was covering demonstrations over the weekend in Brooklyn, and she's saying, I've been in the business for nearly 40 years. Why is this still the story?
I think this is because this is kind of the latest in a series of similar events. At the beginning of this year alone, there were several at least two other high-profile cases, that of Ahmaud Arbery, and there was new information about the conditions surrounding his death yesterday. Two individuals, a father and son, who killed him while he was jogging. They were just revealed yesterday that they used racial slurs over his body after having shot him, and of course, that video had circulated as well. And then there was the case of Breonna Taylor, which gathered a lot less attention. A lot of people saying that, the lives of Black women are maybe less valued than the lives of Black men. But either way, similar case of an unarmed Black woman, this time being killed by police. And now we have, in addition to that, George Floyd. So I think it's just a lot. Again, the final event in a series of similar events within the span of 2 or 3 months, without speaking of, all of the similar cases that occurred over the past 10 years. And I think people are finally saying, this is enough. Black people, white people, Latino people. I think what's also really unprecedented about this event is that the protests and reaction to it are super mixed and diverse.
It's been nearly 3 decades, Régis Le Sommier, since the beating of Rodney King by Los Angeles police was captured on video and sparked outrage when they were acquitted and riots. You were the U.S. correspondent for Paris Match in the early 2000s. After that, Barack Obama became president. Again, it feels as though each time we're reinventing the wheel.
Yeah, it seems that throughout the time, and you can go back to the years of '68, where similar outrage was sparked after the death of Martin Luther King, and there was chaos on a wide basis, because you just referred to Los Angeles riots in 1992. While those riots were mostly centered in some neighborhoods of Los Angeles, it created chaos. It lasted for weeks, but it was not widespread in the country as it is today. I think the problem we faced by the Americans today, by America today, is a collision course of many things. There's, of course, the legitimate outrage over the death of George Floyd, horrible death seen by everyone, caught on camera. But it's not the first time. I mean, there have been Ferguson a couple of years ago. There's been other instances of white policemen killing black guys. But today we have to bear in mind that America is facing COVID. America has lost between 30 and 40 million jobs, and right now the country is really struggling. The tension come at this moment, and I think on top of this, there's a legitimate outcry over of all Americans, of a number of Americans, regarding the feeling of impunity of the police force, of the law enforcement forces in America. It is something very sensitive. It's something that's been going on for decades. This feeling that the police can do absolutely what they want regarding minorities, but also regarding other people. And I think there's a legitimate call today to rein in this police, to not to let these police, and especially when you talk about Minnesota, for instance, you have on top of the police over there some guys that are crooked, some guys that are known for having bad practice, and there's some legislation that have been tried to put in place, but obviously it's not enough. And so there's, I think, the combination of these three things which creates in America today a perfect collision cause. I would add another item to that is Donald Trump himself and the extreme polarization of the society. But I think you have to take into account all these parameters to explain why the violence has sparked on such a wide basis today, these days.
Yeah, we saw those scenes, people protesting Monday evening around the White House going dark, and then on Tuesday, the police clearing a path for Donald Trump to visit a church across the street where a small fire had been put out the previous night. Marco Chonovid, what's it look like from your side of the border when you watch that?
Well, I think that is the essential, one of these questions that reoccurs in Canada all the time. There's a sort of famous saying that comes up all the time about being in Canada. It's like sleeping with an elephant. If the United States sneezes, we catch a cold. And that really is the feeling here, is that even though the killing of George Floyd happened across the border in the United States, it has felt like it happened here in Canada. And this, the protests have gone coast to coast, and people really feel like this is also an issue that affects us. And then uncannily, absolutely, we're seeing protests in Vancouver on the West Coast. We're seeing protests in Montreal, in Toronto. Today, we have a giant protest. Today, Friday, we have a giant protest planned for Toronto, where the police chief himself will be protesting against police violence.
Wow. And when you heard a moment ago Mandakini Galot, Régis Le Sommier spell out the different components in this, the racism, the police brutality, Donald Trump, which of those elements resonates the most where you are?
Well, again, I'm sorry.
Mandakini Galot.
Okay. Francois, sitting here in what is famously the world's largest democracy, watching events in the world's oldest democracy, it's alarming. What an extraordinary, unprecedented moment in American history. And as you said, sadly, so familiar. It feels like every week there's a new case of police violence against Black people and people of color. I was watching the video you just showed of Donald Trump standing there awkwardly with the Bible. Is he taking an oath? Is he reading it? I mean, this is going to go down as one of the dark moments in his presidency, in a presidency that is littered with so many dark moments. The very fact that he would, his police force would use violence against protesters just so that he can have this photo op. I think it's unlikely that people across the world will forget this anytime soon, much less Americans. So I think the Donald Trump factor is a big one. And I wonder whether if it was a different president or when there will be a different president, hopefully in the next election, whether there will be any difference.
The Donald Trump factor. And the Donald Trump factor was certainly something on the Canadian Prime Minister's mind when he was asked about events south of his border.
We do have Donald Trump now calling for military action against protesters. We saw protesters tear gas yesterday to make way for a presidential photo op. I'd like to ask you what you think about that. And if you don't want to comment, what message do you think you're sending?
We all watch in horror and consternation what's going on in the United States. It is a time to pull people together, but it is a time to listen. It is a time to learn what injustices continue despite progress over years and decades. But it is a time for us as Canadians to recognize that we too have our challenges.
21 seconds of silence, Marco. What do you make of that?
Well, the most famous 21 seconds of dead air in Canada right now. You're not supposed to have silence on the air, but we have put that 21 seconds on a loop on every channel of the television, every radio station. It is, I think, one of these examples of something where it's what he's not saying that sends the real message. As I mentioned before, we're kind of stuck here in Canada where we know that we can't say anything that would ever damage the most important international relationship we have, that with the United States. And when we have things going on south of the border or controversial issues that our politicians are asked about, they really have to avoid at all costs saying anything that could ever then come back to hurt them. For a classic example would be that during the NAFTA renegotiation, any word that any politician said in Canada would be used as a pretext to slap tariffs on some major industry. And so I think that was exactly what was going through Trudeau's mind.
Were those 21 seconds spontaneous or was that planned?
I think we're going to have to let everyone decide for themselves. But, the critics of Trudeau here in Canada have long said that the problem with him is he's all style and no substance, and that everything about him is very contrived. Everything about him is very planned. And if you're to believe those critics, you might think that he was anticipating a question along those lines and wanted to use those 21 seconds of silence to send a very strong message to everyone in Canada who I believe heard it very wide and clear that he can't even imagine what was going through Trump's mind and what would, how that could ever, he would love to be criticizing. And I think he did criticize with those seconds of silence. And it was a message Canadians heard, but that couldn't be used against us by Americans.
Again, Narendra, you heard Régis talk about how there's sort of four parts to this story. The pressure born of COVID, racism, police brutality, and Donald Trump himself. Are we focusing too much on the U.S. president?
I mean, I'm tempted to say yes, because I think, like many people have been saying right now is definitely the time to listen perhaps to the people who have experience with similar situations, the family of George Floyd, the families of Eric Garner, the families of Ahmaud Arbery. So many other people, I think, have things to say. And of course, also victims of police violence that hasn't led to a death. There are people who are still alive. Rodney King eventually, I believe, committed suicide, if my memory serves me well. But there are people who have been through similar cases who I think are important voices to hear at a time like this. At the same time, Donald Trump is the president of the United States. He has, whether people like it or not, enormous influence, not only on perhaps what will happen moving forward, but also in terms of his ability to stoke reactions out of people, either reactions from his supporters or reactions out of his critics. So I don't really know that there's a good response to that question.
Difficult one to judge. By the way, the front page of Marco's newspaper this Friday, the Toronto Star, picks up on the calls we've been seeing more and more to defund the police, saying they have outsized powers. Mandakini Gallo, that issue of police brutality, how much has it resonated as we've watched events unfold in the United States, where you are over the past week?
A lot, Francois. There's definitely a lot of people here watching very carefully what's going on in America, because police brutality isn't new to those of us in India. In fact, it was only in December when one of the biggest protest movements or challenges to Prime Minister Modi's government that had broken out. Students were on the streets for several months, and the police across the country, but especially in the state of Uttar Pradesh, which is India's most populous state, used plenty of violence. You had over 50 people killed in those protests, likely at the hands of the police, although this isn't something they've admitted so far. Now, just yesterday, there were videos from Rajasthan of a police official who was questioning a person who wasn't wearing a mask, and it sort of broke out into a scuffle. And the next thing they knew, this guy was on the floor, and he had his knee, or the police officer had his knee on this guy's neck, much like what happened to George Floyd. It lasted only a few seconds, but today it's all over social media in India, and there's a lot of resonance with people asking, well, if people in America can protest against police violence, why aren't we doing the same?
And there was protest against police violence right here in France this week. We saw Justice pour Adama, Justice for Adama rally. Rallies are banned, by the way, in France right now because of social distancing rules linked to COVID-19. Yet there were 20,000 who turned out for a young man of African origin, of Malian origin, who in 2016 died at the hands of the gendarmes. His sister was among those who led that rally outside of central courts on the outskirts of Paris.
Adama a pris le poids de 3 gendarmes sur lui. George Floyd a pris le poids de 3 policiers sur lui. Ils ont eu les mêmes mots. Je n'arrive plus à respirer, je n'arrive plus à respirer.
Régis Le Sommier, your thoughts on that demonstration we saw Tuesday in Paris?
Well, that surprised everyone. I mean, not the demonstration itself, because the family of Traoré has been pushing for the case to be reopened for quite a while, and they've tried to demonstrate or make themselves visible, which they know sometimes very well how to do. But this time around, what was surprising is the number of people who showed up. 20,000 you mentioned. They also interrupted the périphérique for a while, so they blocked the traffic over there. But hoping, I think some of the most extreme left elements that are with them were hoping to trigger or to ignite the same type of movement following George Floyd death in the US. But I don't think the Traoré case has the same resonance. It was back in 2016. The case was closed. Now it's being reopened. Of course, it's a case of police violence, but some of the judgments so far have cleared the police or the gendarmerie of any wrongdoing. So it's not quite the same, and it's not as visible. I think what made George Floyd case very visible is the fact that it was caught on camera and the type of death that everybody could see, and so that triggered
But do you agree there is a parallel over the fact that the police and the gendarmes very often they get the benefit of the doubt when there is this kind of case? We saw it this week in New York City, where you can see a police car ramming into the crowd, and then the mayor choosing his words carefully because he doesn't want to upset the policemen's union.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. That goes back to my previous remark about the feeling of impunity that the law enforcement has in the U.S. In France, it's not quite the same. Somebody, I can't remember who, but said the French police wounds a lot. And it was the case with the Gilets jaunes. There have been cases of eyes being popped and other awful thing, or hands being cut and stuff like that. But there's not been, we've had a year-long riots with the Gilets jaunes, and there's not been any case of death related to police intervention. Only, there have been a few people died with the Gilets jaunes, but not directly from at the hands of police or law enforcement. So it's quite different. The attitude of the police in France is quite different, and I don't think we're seeing the same type of brutality. I don't think that there's the movement could go as far in France. So I may be wrong, because as in the US, we're probably going to pay. We'll be waiting to see what are going to be the consequence on the social scale of the confinement, and are there going to be new round of riots? And I would bet that September here is going to be a difficult month.
Aaron Gunke, do you agree with Régis Le Sommier that it's a stretch to compare the two cases?
I don't. I think I understand what people mean when they say that. I think no two cases are ever exactly the same, which also applies to the U.S. I mean, the context surrounding Michael Brown's death in 2014 is not the same as that of Ahmaud Arbery, and so on and so forth. But what I find to be fascinating is that I think in talking to French people here, often the violence and the frequency of these cases happening in the U.S. and then the videos where we can all see what happened, are kind of used as an excuse, I feel, in France to say, look at the United States, look how horrible it is over there. Here, it's nothing like that, so we don't even really need to have a conversation about it. And whether or not the individual cases can be compared or not, I think it merits having a discussion, to the extent that there have been several controversial cases in France, not only Adama Traoré, but Théo, who was sodomized by police officers, and I think the beginning of his arrest was also filmed. There are several cases, of course, Yere Bouna in 2005. So there are things that merit a debate, I think. And I think it's very, very hard for that debate to take place in France, to the extent that often it's turned back on, well, look at the United States. This is nothing like that.
Yeah, Marco Cianovid, we talked about it earlier in a show earlier this week here, about the fact that here in France, Black Lives Matter, written in English, was the #1 hashtag trending on Twitter. Do you feel as though when there's a conversation in the US, the whole rest of the world follows it?
Well, I would say it's inevitable. We are all watching what's going on in the United States. The cultural force of the United States is absolutely giant. And as the English language spreads, I mean, the American influence spreads as well. Here in Canada, I think, the same argument is often made, is we're not as bad as the United States. So, and that's used as a way to shut down these kinds of conversations. But what has happened very interestingly here in Canada is now this is the second time where, when Black Lives Matters sort of sparks up in the United States, we have a very similar incident that happens very uncannily right at the same time in Canada. So 3 years ago, right after the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, we had not a week later the killing of a black man in Toronto by police, a man named Andrew Loku. Of course, the circumstances were slightly different, but what it did is it added fuel to the fire, and all of a sudden, the protests, which started as solidarity protests for Black Lives Matter in the United States, turned into a truly Canadian Black Lives Matter, where accountability for Canadian police officers was being demanded. And this same thing has actually happened again this week. So not 3 days after the killing of George Floyd, we had in Canada an incident where a young woman named Regis Korchinski-Paquette was in her apartment alone with 6 police officers, and no one knows exactly what happened, except she plunged 24 stories to her death with those 6 police officers in the apartment. And so, again, what started as a solidarity protest with Black Lives Matter in the United States has very much turned into a anti-racist police violence conversation here in Canada. And a lot of the same issues come around. Issues around body cams, for example, are the big call right now, where they're saying, why weren't those 6 police officers wearing body cams so we can see what happened inside that apartment building? And of course, in the United States, body cams aren't a save-all. We know that one of the officers at the George Floyd death was wearing a body cam, but that officer was standing so far away from the incident itself that his film wasn't really useful for showing what went on. And so while we know body cams aren't actually ever going to be a save-all or solve every problem, they've become a bit of the crux of the conversation here in Canada. And police forces are sort of saying we're going to accelerate their rollout and put them on every police
one
officer.
final word on this before we move on. The funeral, which is memorials are taking place in 3 parts for George Floyd. The funeral taking place Monday in Houston, and I know you have relatives there. The thoughts on how many people can gather, because this is all happening again in the time of a pandemic.
What I think is really fascinating on that, Francois, is I've heard many friends and family members say, yes, a pandemic is happening, but what is happening, the context surrounding police brutality, and particularly against Black men, is more important than the pandemic. I think other people have said that racial violence or racial police brutality, racialized police brutality rather, is worse of a pandemic than the coronavirus. So you're kind of hearing all sorts of things to that effect, which is that, yes, there's a risk, but we're willing to take that risk. And if we don't, it's just going to be swept under the rug and it's never going to be talked about. So I think it's true that people are trying to take precautions, and several of the images that I've seen, people are wearing masks. Obviously, social distancing is difficult in the context of protests where there are hundreds, if not thousands of people. But I think people are really trying to do what they can to stay safe, all while not allowing this to kind of disappear and be forgotten.
Yeah, we're entering that period now where many countries are starting to ease lockdown, are pushing to ease lockdown. Régis Le Sommier, you and your team are just back from Brazil, where the light at the end of the tunnel seems very far away at this point. Brazil, which has now leapfrogged Italy into 3rd place in terms of numbers of death from COVID-19. What did you find there?
Well, I came at a critical moment. I arrived on last Sunday in Sao Paulo. You see that this first picture was taken from Villa Formosa, which is the biggest cemetery in the whole South America. And what you can see, you have a family on the right and you have a family on the left. The family dead has been just buried. You can see that one of the shovel is still putting some ground back on the coffin, and right away you have another coffin that's coming up with the other family. So it's back-to-back funerals in that cemetery. Some 13,000 holes have been pre-arranged, have been dug by some people from the cemetery. So they're expecting, and so it's a constant flow of funerals that are, and the people, you can see there are only 5 people allowed. The families, most of the big chunk of the families are staying outside the cemetery. So it's really, it was my first scene of Brazil when I arrived on Sunday, and then we moved to Manaus, which is this is a a picture taken from a home, because people are dying at home, and those people you see in white are called SOS Funeral. It's a company that has been created by the municipality of Manaus to pick up people in their own home, and you can clearly see in one picture like this that of course the woman is paying her last farewell to her husband, but she does not, she only has a mask. She's taking, and of course, as we know with COVID, the bodies are very, very full of virus, and so the virus spread. You have instances like with the indigenous people, which we followed along the Rio Negro, which is one of the main affluents of the Amazon River. The people, when an indigenous used to die from COVID, well, the people leave him in the home and they take refuge to the neighbor. So of course they contaminate the neighbor, and so there's a right now the epidemic is dying out a little bit inside Manaus city, but it's spreading along the river all the way to the little indigenous village on the border of Colombia, of Peru. So it's the figure you gave of 30,000 is expected to rise to 125,000 in August in the whole Brazil. So it's really not done yet.
And yet we have a president of Brazil who's calling for the country to reopen now. Let's listen to Jair Bolsonaro.
O que está acontecendo no Brasil ultimamente, com essas medidas que estão tomando aí? Tá? Pobre está ficando miserável, classe média está ficando pobre.
Régis Le Sommier, your reaction?
Well, it's always we have to bear in mind that Bolsonaro crazy policy and what he advocates is a little surrounded in Brazil by the constitution. It is to the power of the governor to actually lock down their area, which somebody from like João Doria, who's the governor of Sao Paulo, did. And Sao Paulo is a very big business center. So while we were over there was a major protest by the Bolsonaro partisan to reopen the Sao Paulo state and reopen some activity over there. So it's always the question lingering that pandemic has been: do we lock down and lose economically, and protect the health of people, or do we not lock down and think that the virus will have minimum effect? The problem is, in some countries the virus had limited effect, I would say, but it's always been a balance, and I don't think anyone in the world found eventually the solution. I think the Germans did a good job. The South Koreans did a good job because they were able to test and isolate people instead of locking everything down. France has chose the other way because there was a number of indecisions at the beginning. Bolsonaro is quite an extreme example because along with Trump, he's decided to ignore the virus. Trump has sort of stepped back from that vision and decided to take measure. Bolsonaro hasn't. That's the thing. We saw him doing jet ski and inviting people around him. Keep doing rallies all over the Brazil. So he doesn't really, and I think that we can clearly see that his policy within Brazil had an impact. It really helped triggering there are other parameters again. The Brazilian society,
but his policies helped to propagate, make the disease worse. The last time we had Mandakini Gala on the world this week, it was the beginning of lockdown in India. We recall there were all those migrant workers who were suddenly stranded, unable to return to their villages because they were caught by surprise. Now we're into a second phase of easing of that lockdown, Mandakini. How's it looking?
Absolutely, Francois. Everything that Regis just said really resonates, particularly the scenes that he's describing in Brazil. In India, particularly in the big metropolitan cities like Mumbai or Delhi, you cannot get a hospital bed anymore for love of God or country. The numbers are rising spectacularly. We haven't had, there is absolutely no flattening or dipping of the curve. At the same time, there is another crisis unfolding on the streets, a second plague, if you like, of millions and millions of people who are jobless, many of whom are daily wage earners, so they have no savings, they cannot afford to buy food. So there is a very real hunger crisis. And we have a government that needs to strike a very tricky balance between these two priorities. Are our collective public health priorities more important than the priorities of these millions of daily wage earners? I mean, the economy is in a deep crisis, the largest full year contraction in at least 4 decades, millions who are being pushed further into poverty. So the easing of the lockdown is urgent, it's important, but at the same time, the pandemic isn't going away. The number of cases continues to rise. So they've opened up the trains so that migrant workers can go back home. The buses are functioning again, but the restaurants are closed, the schools are still closed, large gatherings are banned, protests are absolutely banned. So the government here very much trying to strike this tricky balance. And it's interesting because Prime Minister Modi himself is sort of, I would say, an autocratic leader, but he hasn't, from the very beginning, he said that this is important. The coronavirus is a real threat, and we're going to have to find a way to deal with it. And increasingly now he's saying we're going to have to find a way to deal with it and also ensure that our economy isn't destroyed. So it's going to be very interesting come Monday when they ease up even more, and we'll see what happens to that the number of cases which just keeps rising and rising.
Yeah, the politics of coronavirus is a tricky one, that balancing act between public health and keeping the economy from collapsing. We didn't know there was that much politics before this pandemic when it comes to science itself. The big story here in France, or in a lot of places, is we had read that report in The Lancet saying hydroxychloroquine was suddenly a no-go, that it was dangerous based on a study that has now been retracted by that medical journal. The doctor in Marseille, who's been the biggest proponent of it in this country, is not surprised.
Il trouve qu'il y a exactement la même moyenne âge, qu'il y a exactement le même sexe ratio, et je pense que c'est techniquement strictement impossible.
So, Erna Gunke, 2 questions in this. First of all, what do you make of this shift of one day it's bad, the next day it's okay to continue the clinical trials? And secondly, did you ever imagine that medicine would be something so tribal?
Yes, I have a lot of medical professionals in my own family, but that's indeed what I think is so fascinating, is that often, myself included, people see doctors as these kind of holders of objective and absolute truths in science and in medicine. And the reality is, research is a process that is constantly evolving. There are very few definitive answers, and especially not in a disease that was unknown to humans more or less before, late last year. So I think that's what's really fascinating about it, is people coming to terms. We saw the same thing with masks. At first, we were told in France, at least, that they were totally useless. And little by little, now we're in a place where we're obliged to wear them in public transport. We're wearing them in the office. So it just goes to show that, like you say, there's tribalism in medical communities, and it's very, very hard to find objective truths, especially in things that are new.
Marco Chonovid, your thoughts, especially all this talk of chloroquine must bring back memories of your days as a West Africa correspondent.
That's right. I mean, one of the things that has jumped out to me is this conversation between medical professionals, researchers, people, academics who are normally sort of cloistered in their own communities, having these very technical conversations. And now what we're seeing is they're debating online on Twitter, where regular folks can sort of chip in their 2 cents. And these kinds of weird mixed conversations between experts and laymen is something that we've focused on here at the Star. And it is a bit of a double-edged sword, in the sense that it's far more transparent than it's ever been before. And so people can kind of see the process of science, the scientific method, if you will, playing out in real time. But the flip of it, of course, is that people might take a single piece of that conversation out of context and believe that it is the truth, and because a scientist said it, it must be true. And so I think what it's done is it's sort of asked observers of science, non-scientists, to kind of up their scientific literacy, and as as Aaron was saying, to understand that truths are temporary and that conclusions can never really be made and that everything has to be seen in context. But this fascinating worldwide conversation where doctors in Italy are collaborating with researchers in California and who are then talking about what's going on in China or Taiwan. I've spoken to researchers who say, it used to take us a year to get to the level of understanding that we've gotten to in weeks.
Yeah, and what's going on? You mentioned China at its borders. Just quickly before we go, we saw Hong Kong, June 4th commemorations of the Tiananmen Square massacre taking place in pockets despite a ban due to coronavirus this year. We've also had a story that's been a little bit overlooked because of the pandemic, and that is actual fistfights at the disputed border with India. So far, no shots have been fired, Mandakini Gallup, but just tell us before we go, should we worry?
Well, it's like you said, François, no shots have been fired, and that's the de facto border code between these two countries with their combined population of 2.7 billion people. But the soldiers have fought fiercely with rocks and wooden clubs and even fist fights. And in one particular skirmish near a glacial lake up in the Himalayas, several Indian troops were hurt badly enough to be evacuated by helicopter. So what's going on? Quite simply, it looks like it could either be a territorial claim or part of a wider messaging from China to India that they need to be more mindful of China on sensitive geopolitical issues. We don't quite know because both these countries haven't released enough information. Skirmishes are not odd up in the Himalayas. What we do know is that this will be a seasonal fight, because come winter, both countries are going to have to withdraw their troops. But for the moment, they've moved thousands and thousands of troops. Both sides have moved several battalions up to this border, which is at 14,000 feet and is about 3,488 kilometers long. So very intriguing and certainly hasn't been covered.
And we'll continue to keep an eye on it. Mandakini Gallup, I want to thank you so much for joining us from Delhi. I want to thank as well Régis Le Sommier in Caen, Marco Chon Ovid in Toronto, Aaron Agunke for being with us from the studios at France 24 in Paris. We want to thank you for joining us in ever greater numbers. There's more on our website and on France24.com. Bye for now.